Hello everybody. In today's video, I'm going to be showing you how to diagnose, replace, and furthermore rebuild both the front and rear struts on your car. I'll be demonstrating today's video on my 2002 Acura TL-S, which still has the original struts with over 309,000 miles on them. This is going to be a longer detailed video, so be sure to check out the description where you will find timestamps to better navigate through the video, as well as torque specs, links to parts used in the video, and other additional information. So some signs of worn out struts can include rusty struts, oil leaking from the struts, a clunky ride over bumps, and the most common one being a cloudy ride, which you can simply test by pushing down on your vehicle, and if it keeps bouncing up and down, that's usually a sign that your struts are worn out. And although my struts don't give me a cloudy ride, they are rusty and clunky over larger bumps. Next, we're going to move on to a visual inspection, starting with the rear. So we're just going to jack up the vehicle to get a better view at everything. And the first telltale sign is rust. So look for any rust, such as this. These are 309,000 miles old and 18 years old, so definitely a telltale sign that these are time for changing. Just going to inspect the bottom rubber mount. The dust cover looks fine. Top rubber mount looks okay. And unfortunately, I can't really lift up this dust cover to see the bump stop, but usually that's a part that needs to be replaced. We also just need to go under the vehicle and inspect these sway bar end links to check for any rust, because we need to remove them in order to remove the whole strut assembly. And there are two ways you can go about this. First, you can check for any overly significant rust on these bolts, because to remove these bolts without destroying the end link, you need to get an Allen wrench in there, and if it's overly rusted, you won't be able to do that without destroying the end link, and then you would just need to purchase new end links. So check for that. Otherwise, if that fails, I've seen people also just remove this entire bracket right here and remove that, which is connected to the end link at the top, as a backup plan. So again, we're at the front of the vehicle. We're just going to jack it up and do another visual inspection. You can again see that there is rust, indicating that these struts are completely old and worn out. You also just want to check for any oil leaks. Again, check the mount where the spring comes in contact. And these here are the front bump stops for the struts, and you can see up here it is split open and broken. So we definitely want to replace that. It's because these front ones are broken that I'm assuming that the back ones will also need replacing, even though I can't see them. But once it comes time to actually put everything together, I'll let you know if they actually need replacing or not. And then the top looks fine up there, and that's how you do a quick visual inspection on the struts. So here I just want to do a side-by-side comparison with my 309,000 mile strut versus my brand new strut. So let's just see if there's any difference in sound. Definitely should be making that sound on a normal basis. How about the new one? Nope, not nearly as much. The next test I want to do is just to see how fast each of these retract out to full length. So I'm going to push them both all the way down to the ground. Get a good grip. Okay, they're both all the way down, and release. And I think it's finally about done. So yeah, definitely much slower, much noisier, much more rusty, and definitely needed some replacing. So here's the other strut, and this one's even worse. This is what I would consider a pretty much completely failed strut. You can see this one's much more springy. Whoops. also making that noise. But furthermore, what's bad is it really doesn't push that rod back out, or at least it does after a couple minutes of sitting there. So this is a good example of a strut that definitely needs to be changed. So looking at these front struts, they weren't springy when I was pushing the rods in. However, you can notice that neither of them are being pushed back out, a bad sign that you want to look for in struts. This one's so bad that even when taking the pliers, I can't even pull the rod back out. Just goes to show how old and worn and rusted these parts are. So when buying new struts, they're usually stored on the shelves in a horizontal position rather than a vertical position. And what can happen over time is the air fluid levels can tend to get uneven amongst the different chambers. So when you buy your new strut and you push it down to test it, it might have hydraulic pressure in one direction, but then you'll notice it doesn't go back in the other direction. That's no big deal. That's, again, just because it's been stored at a horizontal position. After a while, when it's been in the vertical upright position for a while on your car, or even if you give a couple test runs here, it will start to again function normally. So I'm just gonna assist it out. And if we just push it a couple times like this, eventually it'll start to go and function normally again. I'm already noticing that it's easier to pull it out the second time a little bit. So I primed it about 5 or 10 times now, and I'll just do it one more time for you. And you can already see that it's working its way out by itself. And you don't have to prime it, but if you just wanted to ensure that it is in fact working and pushing the bar back out, you can do it. Otherwise, it will improve with time the longer it's stored in its natural vertical upright position. So if you initially push it down and it doesn't push itself back out, not to worry. It's probably just because it's been stored in an unnatural position. We're gonna order some parts. We're gonna come to my favorite website, AcuraPartsFLS.com, and we're going to select a new vehicle. I've got a 2002 TL Sedan Type S. Come down to Chassis and select rear shock absorber. And on the backs, both shock absorbers are the same, so we will select a quantity of 2. Then we'll make sure to order 2 of these damper bolts. They're only $1 each. I would highly recommend replacing them. Then up here, we're going to order 2 self-locking nuts, 1 for each side. Come down here, we're going to order 4 shock absorbers, 2 for each side. And then order 2 collars, 1 for each side. And then I'll leave it up to you if you want to replace it, as you'll see later in the video, but we're also going to order 2 bump stops, 1 for each side. And then, of course, if you need to order anything else, you can order it as accordingly, such as this dust cover. But now we're going to come back, go back down to Chassis again, and the front shock absorber. And unlike the back, there is a separate shock absorber for each the left and the right side in the front. So we're going to order 1 for the left, and then 1 for the right. And then we're going to order 2 more self-locking nuts. These are the same as the rear. So if you're doing both the front and rear suspension, you can set the quantity for 4. Then we're going to order 4 shock absorbers, 2 for each side. These are different from the back. We're going to add 2 more collars. These are also the same as the back. So again, you can set the quantity to 4 if you're doing both the front and rear suspension. And then here are the bump stops for the front, which you probably saw in my car were torn and completely destroyed. And then we're going to come back again. And although on my car, I don't think you need to replace them, but you can come to the front lower arm. And if you need to replace either the damper pinch bolt, here's that, as well as the main damper fork bolt here, the shock absorber bolt, there's that, and it's also held on with a self-locking nut. I don't think you need to replace those, but just in case, there they are. And last but not least, here's the spring compressor I rented from AutoZone. You can call up your local AutoZone, see if they have it available for renting. And what you'll do is you go in, you'll pay the $53, you'll take it home, use it, bring it back, return it, and then they'll refund you the full $53 again. So it's essentially a free rental, which is really cool. So those are the parts you'll need. So the first step in removing the rear struts is to remove the rear seat. So we just need to grab the front cushion here and give it a pull up. There's a little clip on both sides, so just give it a good tug and that'll come undone pretty easy. Then on the driver's side of this center armrest, we gotta kind of come under the cushion here. And there is that silver bolt right there. We have to remove that bolt. With the rear seat out, you can check for any goodies that may have fallen under the seat. And then we're gonna remove the back cushion part. And there's a bolt right here, as well as on the opposite side over there. And then there's one more in the center right there. So here's a look at the back seat after it's been removed. And what you want to start by doing is removing the center seat belt from this little clip or guide right there. And then you'll notice there's a tab right here, another tab right there, another right there. So 3 on top, and then these 2 on bottom. And basically you just want to lift the seat straight up and forward. Takes a little bit of maneuvering and muscle, but you'll get it after a couple minutes. So the rear seat is completely removed, and we needed to do that so we could get access to the top of the rear strut assembly. And there's a bolt right there, and then one more back there that is holding that assembly in. After removing the rear seat, next we're gonna jack up the entire rear of the vehicle and put it on jack stands. We're gonna remove the rear wheel. And then we're just going to start by spraying this flange bolt at the bottom of the strut with a bunch of WD-40, as well as the top bolt here for the end link as well. Next, we're going to come in the vehicle and we're going to remove these 2 14mm flange bolts. And you can, in fact, get to that back one using a deep socket and a simple ratchet. We are next going to remove the damper bolt, and this is by far the hardest part in replacing the rear struts. The bolt will go in through there, through the strut assembly down there, and threads through the backside right there. And I would highly, highly, highly recommend spraying a bunch of WD-40 on the backside there, spraying some up in here, in between here, as well as the seating surface of the bolt right there, and letting that soak for at least 3 hours and reapplying every half an hour, because you're probably gonna need it. If you're not careful, there is a very high probability that you could break this bolt. So I would be extra careful with that. Furthermore, I would also recommend just replacing this bolt altogether. It costs $1, so just get a new one. Another recommendation I might make is to have a second person watch the bolt as it's sticking through here, and make sure that the bolt's actually churning as the other person with their breaker bar is loosening the bolt, just to ensure that you don't snap the head off this bolt, because if you do that, you're going to be in for one heck of a massive headache. As always, when working with rusty bolts, I highly recommend using a 6-sided socket like this to prevent rounding the head of the bolt. After removing that damper bolt, we next need to remove the top nut from the stabilizer end link. And this can be accomplished by taking a 5mm Allen wrench and putting it into the bolt right there, and then taking a 14mm wrench and putting it over the nut. Then you can use one hand to hold the wrench here and another hand to hold this wrench and loosen said nut. But this is why you need to pre-inspect before you start this project, because in a lot of cases this bolt will be so rusted that you can't get an Allen key in there, or at least it'll strip out. And what they'll end up making you do is probably taking like a vice grip or something, grabbing the back of the bolt there, and ultimately destroying your end link. So you should at least be aware of the condition of your end links or have another set of end links purchased so you're prepared before starting this project. Otherwise, if that fails, what you could also do is remove this bracket bolt here and remove the ABS sensor bracket here, and you can remove this entire end link bracket, and hopefully that'll give you enough room to move it off to the side in order to get the actual damper out. So after you removed that end link nut, you can move it off to the side, and then you'll want to remove the end link on the other side, so you can take the entire sway bar and move it down and out of the way. So when in the next step, when we try to remove the damper out from the knuckle here, the end link won't be in the way. After removing all those bolts, we need to take either a nice long pry bar, or in my case, I found this nice 2x4, and we're gonna prop it up under there, and we're able to push down on the piece of wood or the crowbar to lower the suspension in order for that to come out and remove this damper. So what I did to remove the damper assembly is I sat on the very end of my piece of wood here to get as much torque leverage as possible to push the suspension down. Then at the same time, I took a hammer and hammered it out like that, so it would come out of the knuckle assembly right in there, and then it should fall straight down. So I'm gonna sit down on it. I'm sitting on my piece of wood, I'm gonna hammer this out. There it goes. Sorry, kind of flinched on the camera, but there we have our assembly out. See if I can maneuver it with one hand. On the brake line, and there you have it. So we got our strut assembly out, and this leaves us with one of three options. You could either go out and buy an entire pre-assembled strut assembly, you could take it to a mechanic and they could reassemble it for you, or you could do what I'm about to show you, and we're going to be compressing the spring ourselves and reassembling it and putting some new components in. Obviously, if you take it to a mechanic, it'll cost a little bit more, but if you're going OEM, I would strongly suggest it. I mean, the components might seem pretty expensive. I mean, this strut alone cost 120 bucks, but then again, it did last 309,000 miles, so that's pretty impressive. Unlike buying a pre-assembled unit, I would be a little cautious with that because they tend to be pretty cheap. They don't last as long, and they don't offer as comfortable of a ride. Quite frankly, I think if you're spending less than 150 bucks on an entire strut assembly, it's a cheap piece of crap. I mean, it really shouldn't. 150 bucks should not be paying for a strut, the spring, the dust cover, a bump stop, the spring cushions, the bushings, the nut and the washer. That's pretty cheap. You're not buying a quality product for 150 bucks. I would recommend spending just a little bit extra money for something that you're going to enjoy and be driving with every single day. So for now, we're just going to move on with compressing the spring ourselves. I think it's pretty easy to do, and it is completely safe if you're just cautious and don't do anything stupid, such as using an impact wrench or compressing the spring more than you need to. So why don't we just get started with that? So the first thing we want to do is we just want to take some engine oil and lubricate the bolt, just so it makes the process a little bit easier, as well as reducing any excessive wear on our tool. Then we want to take our compressor and put it on the spring on the complete opposite side from each other, also while creating an equal amount of distance on each end of the spring. I would also recommend not utilizing the entire bolt or trying to grab on the entire spring, just because that creates a more dangerous situation, allowing things to bend and potentially exploding, and things can go flying. So you see how I'm grabbing onto only 3 springs instead of 4? That creates a much safer situation. So we'll just hand tighten those on, get them in place, and we are going to take a ratchet and we're going to be applying an equal amount of pressure on each spring back and forth. So when doing this, you want to stand perpendicular to the strut assembly rather than in front or behind it in case something were to explode. You don't want to be in that line of fire. And so we're now going to just apply an equal amount of pressure to each side. So I'll just start on the one side. Apply a little bit there. I'll just do 4 quarter turns on each side, I think. And we just want to keep doing this until we get a little bit of a gap on each side of the spring. And then we'll be able to remove this nylon locking nut. So we'll just keep going. So we can see now that the spring is no longer centered. So this is all we need to do. That's as much as we need to compress it. After the spring has been compressed, we now need to remove this nylon locking nut. And out of the countless methods I've tried to get that guy off, the only way that has worked is by using a torch to heat up the bolt and an impact wrench. And I know before I said to not use an impact wrench, but I just want to clarify, I was talking specifically about the spring compressors. You can use an impact wrench on that bolt. After a little bit, you should maybe start to see that nylon material start to melt and drip down. So I've been applying to this for a little bit now, so I think I can give my impact wrench another try. Careful, as it is very hot. It does like to spin a lot, that's the only problem. We're making progress, almost there I think. There we have it. So we have the entire strut assembly disassembled, so I'm just going to go through one little part at a time just to describe how I managed to take it apart. So while the strut is still in the spring over there, the first part is to remove this nylon locking nut. It's very difficult to remove, both in the fact that it has a nylon ring in there, and I'm pretty sure that there was some thread locker on the threads there from the factory. So I was able to take this off by torching it and applying a bunch of heat and using an impact wrench to take that off. And while using the impact wrench, you might want to hold on to the components to make sure none of them spin. After that, this washer just kind of comes right off. You'll notice there's kind of a little hollowed out side on one end and then a flat side on the other. This hollowed out side goes up. Then we have a little rubber bushing here. This just kind of sits right in there and it comes right out. You notice there's a flat side and a pointed side. The flat side goes down in there. And of course we just have this part. This came right off, no problem at all. Next part was removing this little collet here, this little steel collet. And I was able to remove that by taking a chisel and hammering in between the little crease in there, just to create some separation and increase the diameter of it. And then I was able to take pliers and kind of wiggle it the rest of the way off. Then we have another bushing here. This time the pointed side goes down, flat side goes up. Then we got this other washer here. This just kind of sits on the dust cover like that, and this was also pretty difficult to remove as it's pretty rusted, so I was able to kind of wiggle it free by taking that chisel in between there and kind of creating some separation. Then we were able to take this off pretty easy, just kind of give it a little twist, and then it slides right off. So this is the bump stop plate. This was also kind of difficult to remove. I managed to get it off using an adjustable wrench and allowing just enough wiggle room that I could do this and just smack it off. And you can remember that the part that kind of sticks out goes down because it'll fit into the bump stop. Speaking of which, this is the bump stop. It's got a wider diameter on one end and a smaller diameter on the other. And the smaller diameter will go down first. And you can see this is kind of getting a little bit deteriorated on the one end. So here's just a quick side-by-side comparison with the new one being on the left. You can see the one on the right is a bit smashed in after all those miles of use. It is a $25 part, so again, it's up to you if you want to replace it. Overall, you're going to need to replace the nylon nut. You want to replace this bushing. You want to replace this metal sleeve, the other bushing, and then maybe consider replacing this bump stop here. When reassembling the bushings, this metal collar isn't initially long enough to make it through both of the bushings. So what you want to do is you'll start the collar through one bushing, put the other bushing on top of this metal plate here, and then we can set it on the ground and take a piece of metal or something and press down, force that collar through a little bit, just to get it started on this second bushing to ensure that everything's properly lined up when we put our nylon locking nut on and compress everything. Also keep note on the back of this part, you can see the little indentation of the spring kind of right there. You want to line that up when putting this part back on. Upon putting everything back together, we just want to make sure everything's properly lined up. So on this rubber cushion here, you'll probably notice there was an indent from the spring. We just want to make sure the end of that is lined up. And then also over here, we're just gonna make sure that the dust cover, the end of the spring, and this part of the damper is all lined up as well. With everything pretty much reassembled, the last little step is to put that new nylon locking nut on. And what you can do is you can take your 14mm wrench on the nut and a 5mm Allen wrench on the bolt, and you can start it most of the way like that. So you're supposed to torque this nylon locking nut down to 22 foot-pounds. However, due to the poor design, it's rather difficult to achieve since most people will lack the tools. So if you do have these certain tools, what you could do is you could take your 14mm wrench, put it on the nut, and then here I have what is essentially a socket version of an Allen wrench, and you can put it on your torque wrench. If your torque wrench has the ability to torque stuff down via the lefty-loosey motion, you could try it like that. Otherwise, mine does not. It's just a hard lock when loosening bolts, and then it only torques when making the righty-tighty motion. So if you have that type of torque wrench, you could use that. Otherwise, I've got this old school conventional one, and we can try torquing it down like that. And if all else fails, we can use the impact wrench and tighten it down like that. I don't think you should have too much to be worried about, because as you're tightening the nut down, it's compressing these bushings, and this washer will ultimately stop once it presses up against this collar here. So with the new nylon nut torqued down to about 21 foot-pounds, we can again double check that everything is lined up, and we can evenly loosen our spring compressor. So we're just going to do kind of the opposite of what we did before. I'm going to loosen it 4 quarter turns. Same thing on the other side now, 4 quarter turns. all while ensuring that everything remains lined up. That one's actually loose, so we're gonna just finish this one the rest of the way. And there is our newly assembled strut. So now it's time to put the damper back in. And so first we'll just kind of slide it on in place. You might need to push down on the rotor a little bit if that helps to position it in place. And then we'll guide it up on top, guide those bolts through the holes. And then you might have to have long arms or a second person to help you with this part, but you'll need to hold it up with one hand here. And then you'll need to come around inside the car. You can see the bolts right there, and you'll need to get the nuts started on there. For now, we're just gonna put them on loosely, while at the same time, making sure it's got a little bit of slack. And so now we just need to come down here a little bit, and we need to ensure that the damper is perpendicular with the knuckle so it slides right in place. And if it's off by a little bit, you can take a little screwdriver, stick it through the damper hole there, and you can turn it in whichever direction you need so it'll slide right in place. So now we just need to take our piece of wood or pry bar. We'll get it propped up under the car there in front of this leading arm, I think it's called. Careful of your splash shield here. And we'll need to push the suspension down pretty far to the point that the knuckle is below the damper itself. And then we can kind of get it in place. Let up off of the piece of wood a little bit. And let the suspension line itself up. And we'll get it lined up. It's easier with two hands, and then we will guide in that bolt. So we've got that bolt started by hand about 95% of the way. We still want it to be a little bit loose. And as you're guiding that bolt through, what you can do is you can take your pry bar and kind of wiggle the suspension, and that'll help guide it through the rest of the way. So we can take out our piece of wood or our crowbar, and then what we need to do is we need to come under the knuckle, and you'll see this little part sticks down right there. We actually need to look a little further more inside towards the central part of the knuckle, and we need to jack it up until the full weight of the vehicle is being supported by the strut assembly now. And so that means our jack stand should be loose, but we're still gonna keep it there. And then we can torque that damper bolt down to 43 foot-pounds. And with the weight of the vehicle still on that damper, we can then come in the car and we can torque these top two bolts down to 37 foot-pounds. After torquing down those top bolts, you can take out your jack so the vehicle is once again supported by your jack stand. And then we gotta come to the end link and we gotta torque down this bolt right here. You'll just need to take a 5mm Allen wrench, put it in the end of the bolt, then take a 14mm wrench and tighten that nut down. And then last but not least, we can torque that nut down to 29 foot-pounds. And we'll do that on both sides. Then we can put our wheels back on, torque those lug nuts down to 80 foot-pounds, and we are all finished with the back suspension. So now we got to put the seat back in. So you'll see these little notches up top here. They look like that, as well as a couple hooks on the bottom. And we'll need to line those tabs up. But first, we'll just get the seat in place, put it under the seat belts, and then we'll align all those tabs. So I found it was easiest to put the seat in from the driver's side. You'll first guide it under this center seat belt there, and then wrap these other two side seat belts around. And then you can take the entire seat assembly and just lift it straight on up. The seat belts will kind of suck it in, and then you drop it straight down, and it's that easy to put it back in, much easier than taking it out. Then you can guide the center seat belt through this little clip here, and then we got to put 3 screws back in. There's one right there, as well as on the opposite side. And then of these 2 brackets, we'll put the passenger side screw back in. This one's for the actual seat cushion that you sit on. So we'll get the other half back in next. we got the bottom seat cushion in, and so first we'll take our seatbelt clips and guide those above the seat, and then we'll push it all back in place. And then in the center front of each of the cushions, there's a clip. You'll push down nice and hard. You'll hear it click in place. And then we have to get this driver's side bolt in. It's a bit of a tight squeeze, but if you take your one hand, kind of separate the cushions, and then you can start that bolt with a nice long extension, and it really isn't too hard. But yeah, we've got the entire seat back in place, rear suspension all done, and now we can move on to the front. So to start things off for the front suspension, we need to set our e-brake. We're gonna pop the hood open, then we're gonna jack up the front of the vehicle, both sides, and we're gonna place it on jack stands, and we're gonna remove both of the wheels. And then we need to start by spraying some bolts down with WD-40. On both sides, we'll have these 5 bolts up on top, as well as we'll just give that a little spray too. That's the actual damper. And then we're gonna come down here, and on top of this fork, there's a bolt right here. We'll spray that on each side and in the center there. And then coming on down a little more, we've got this fork damper bolt on the bottom. We'll give that spray in between each side of the fork and on the bolt. And we're gonna, again, apply WD-40 multiple times just to let that soak and ensure that we don't break any bolts. So we've let those bolts soak in penetrating fluid for a couple hours, and now we're gonna start by removing this damper pinch bolt on top. I might also recommend applying some heat to the threaded side over here to aid in the removal process, and then I was able to use an impact wrench to remove it safely. And also, you can keep an eye on this threaded side to ensure that it's spinning so you don't break the head off your bolt. We can then move on down and we'll remove the bolt that goes between the fork and the damper itself. And so again, let that soak with some penetrating fluid for a few hours, and then you can apply some heat to the nut to aid in the removal process. And again, I use an impact wrench to break that nut loose. Came right off. And then you can use 2 ratchets to work it the rest of the way off. And after the nut comes off, you can just take a hammer and lightly tap it out. Comes right out. So with all those bolts out, now we have to remove the actual fork itself. So I think I'm just gonna try tapping it with a hammer, and it should hopefully just drop straight down and out. So I've just been hammering back and forth a couple times. You can see some separation right there, so I'm just gonna keep going. There we have it. And to remove it, I just simply took the damper itself. I kind of gave it a tug towards the front of the vehicle like that. And then I lifted it up and out in the other direction. Now we're gonna come up on top and we're gonna remove these 5 nuts right there. These 3 are 14 and those 2 are 12. And I'm just gonna use my impact wrench to remove them. After those 5 bolts have been removed, we'll come down here and we're going to take our jack and we're gonna put it under the knuckle there, and we're just gonna jack it up enough so this upper control arm is almost parallel with the ground, just so we can create a bigger opening, and then we can guide the damper over this control arm back there and guide it down and out like that. And we have our front damper out. Okay, it's time to compress the springs again. You might notice I have a different spring compressor tool. I rented this one from AutoZone because the one I had didn't fit the small diameter of the coils at the bottom there. I'll put a link in the description for the AutoZone one that you can rent. So we're gonna clamp on to 5 coils. We're gonna put them again on opposite sides of each other. We're gonna take a little bit of engine oil or something to lubricate the bolt to prevent any damage or excessive wear to the tool. And we're going to compress this until we start to notice a little bit of a gap towards the bottom end of the strut, or the smaller diameter part. Once you see a smaller diameter part and you can take the strut and spin it, then you know it's time to move on to removing this bolt. And again, same thing like last time, we're gonna do about 4/4 turns on each side. All right, so we've got our spring compressed to the point that we can wiggle the damper underneath the bottom part of the spring. You can kind of see there. So now we're gonna come up top, we're gonna apply some heat to this nut, and we're gonna remove it. All right, we're gonna heat that bolt and try and melt that nylon plastic material inside there. I can see it sizzling out. And that flame is probably the material burning too. And notice how my part is on the cardboard. We're just gonna make sure we're safe and don't start any fires. And I would assume that's warm enough. Since we don't care about ruining this strut assembly, I'm just going to take the vice grips here. And off it comes. With that nut off, we'll then remove the washer and the first little bumper stop. And then we need to take a chisel and we're gonna hammer kind of inwards and downwards, kind of at a 45-degree angle. And we're gonna create a little bit of separation on that collet piece right there, just enough to loosen it up. You can kind of see. And then we can remove this entire black piece on top. We've got that top piece removed. We got the other little rubber piece out. And then with the whole strut still in the assembly, we need to remove this part. There's a little washer and a cover there. I still got my vice grips on. And then we should be able to remove the strut out the bottom like so. And then we're gonna have to remove this washer. We can do the same thing that we did before, where I kind of took a adjustable wrench and I just kind of smacked it down like that. So we'll get that off and then we'll take this guy off. So before you put everything back together, unlike the backs where the struts are the same, in the fronts they are a different part. There is a separate strut for the left and a separate strut for the right. So make sure you have the correct part number before you put it in the spring. So we'll just kind of put everything back on the order we took it off. So we got our bump stop there. Might need to, there we go, get it past the little collet or whatever you want to call it right there. Then we got our washer. Remember to put everything back on the correct orientation that you took it off. We got that. Then we got this little cup and the washer on top of that. There we go. And then we need to take the collet, start it in the first little rubber piece here, only about a quarter of the way, maybe halfway. There we go. It's in there just a little bit. Then we'll put it through the back. Compress that real good in there so it's nice and tight. Then we gotta put the other bump stop on top of that. So again, we can kind of set it on the ground and compress it. There we go. So we've got the other half started like that. So that caulk sleeve is in both of the bushings there. And again, we'll just kind of compress it together. Make sure it's on as snug and tightly as possible. And then we'll take our strut, guide it up. Oops, actually, we have to put just this part through the bottom because this guy won't make it past my clamps. So we'll guide that in. Line up the bottom of the spring here with the strut assembly, just like so. Now we can put this little cup on top. Cup and its washer. Take this, put this on top. And you can see the little indentation of the spring from before. We'll line it up with that. So we'll put that on, line it on up. There we go. And then we got a little bit of the strut that sticks through here. We'll take our washer, the little indented part kind of goes outward. I don't know how to describe that. The shiny surface goes in. How about that? There we go. And then we'll get our new nylon locking nut. So now we'll just take our 5mm Allen wrench and a 14mm regular wrench, and we'll tighten it on the rest of the way. And then lastly, we'll take our 14mm wrench, put it over the nut. We've got our Allen wrench socket connected to our conventional torque wrench, and we're gonna torque that nut down to 22 foot-pounds again. And then we will decompress the spring while again doing about 4/4 turns on each side to relieve the pressure evenly. So we can take just the damper itself, guide it back up the way we took it out, and then we can loosely reinstall these 5 nuts. Just so there's a little bit of wiggle room to put that fork back on. After the struts back in, we can lower the jack back down and pull that back out. Before putting this fork back on, I might recommend just kind of cleaning up the inside mating surface a little bit, and then maybe taking a dab of engine oil and just kind of lightly lubricating that surface as well. I'm gonna try and demonstrate how to put this fork back in. So we'll kind of start it off from behind. Get it down on in there. Pull the damper back off to the side. And there we go. It's a lot easier putting it in than taking it out. I also might recommend kind of cleaning out the threads where the bolts go in, and also cleaning off the bolts themselves. But yeah, we'll get the fork back in. We'll start the pinch bolt loosely. You can see it's not on there all the way. And then we'll get this bottom fork bolt started as well. Get it about 95% tightened with just a little bit of slack. And when putting this bolt back in, it might help to take your jack and just jack up the knuckle like 1/4 of an inch just to help get everything lined up. So with all the bolts loosely hand tightened down there, we can next raise the vehicle with the jack until the full weight of the vehicle is being supported by the strut and our jack stand is loose. And I'm just simply going to jack it up right below the strut. So this is the knuckle, this is the fork for our damper, and then we got this metal piece here. Just gonna jack it up right there. When jacking it up, you wanna make sure that you didn't accidentally tighten your pinch bolt too tight to the point that the damper can't go in the fork. So you'll see there's a little divot right there. So as we jack it up a little bit here, you'll see it kind of go the rest of the way in. That's what you want to see as you're jacking it up. and then we'll support the full weight of the vehicle with our jack under the knuckle there. So we've got it jacked up just enough for our jack stand to be loose. And now we're gonna torque down the damper pinch bolt to 32 foot-pounds. Next, we can torque down the bottom fork bolt nut down to 47 foot-pounds. Then we're gonna come up top and torque the 3 larger nuts down to 37 foot-pounds, and then those 2 smaller ones off to the side to 12 foot-pounds. After torquing everything down, we can just ensure that our jack is still in place, and then we can lower our jack. There we are. And then we can put the damper in on the other side. We can put our wheels back on, and we're all finished. So I've driven about 1,000 miles on my new Struts, and I wouldn't say there's a world's of difference, but there was a noticeable difference. First thing I noticed was how the steering felt tighter and more responsive since the struts aren't so springy anymore or give out as easily. This also helps me feel the bumps in the road better in a good way, meaning I can feel the feedback better and I feel more connected to the road. The clunkiness over larger bumps has also disappeared now that I have new bump stops in my suspension as well. Plus, it's also nice knowing I've replaced those old rusty 309,000 mile struts with nice shiny new ones. So as always, I want to say thanks for watching. Check out the description for more information and feel free to leave a comment or ask a question. I certainly try my best to respond to everybody, even on my older videos. So I hope you all have a great day, take care, and I'll see you all in the next video.